so you can use this one. Well, we shall continue on the same subject of from crisis management to conflict prevention with this panel where we have a distinguished panelists. We have someone is, by the way, is missing, but we have Ambassador Dr. Cynthia Schneider, former U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, among others, professor in Georgetown. We have on the other side Dr. Fawaz Gerges, who has already spoken today. We have from the London School of Economics. Okay. We have Ahmad Jalali, who has also spoken today, former Interior Minister of Afghanistan. And if someone knows about what crisis management means, it's probably you who have been most experienced it at first hand. And then we have, yes, because there was also Joris Voohoeve on the list, but he is not here. So we have the former First Minister of Scotland, Lord Jack McConnell. We have already introduced the subject, and I've actually opened the floor to all of you panelists. I hope we can do this in a very open and non-formalized manner. So please take the floor on your own initiative. I will just try to guide you so that you don't all speak at the same time. And please feel free to comment others as well. And at one point we will be also again taking some questions from the audience as well. You are free to comment on the remarks I made. You are free to dissent from them, and you are free to ignore them. But the subject is how do we get from conflict prevention, from crisis management to also conflict prevention. But I'd like to start by giving the floor to Ambassador Schneider. And maybe as an American, you can say that if my remarks sounded like a European from Venus versus an American's Martian ears, too keen on soft power and unwilling to take on the hard obligations.
I love to. Is this working, or should I just shout?
I don't mind. Oh, here it goes. It is always such a pleasure to be back at ICD, and I feel so lucky and privileged as an American, because we're far away, to be able to travel here and to other places and to hear from people from other countries how they view the United States. It's an ironic thing to me that my country is so insular. And when Dr. Gerges was speaking earlier about, 60% of Americans think this and that, I hate to tell you, but those same percentages probably don't know the Atlantic from the Pacific. Someone said to me, at least now they know where Alaska is, but still they probably don't know which ocean it's on. And it's just, of course there are many exceptions, and the people you meet are exceptional, but in many respects, America is today really, and I don't mean to go into wild hyperbole, but kind of a country in crisis. We're having a serious financial crisis, which we're not out of, and our education system is in crisis. And we like to think that we are kind of leading globalization. Of course, we have many leading companies, and we produce so many brilliant ideas, yet that has not filtered down. And so we have an educational system where, I am not exaggerating, it is very possible to go through 12 grades of education in the United States and not study any other kind of history than American history. And if you go to university, you will study something else. But if you have the standard public education, you could graduate at age 18 and not have learned anything about any history anywhere else in the world. And so I, in my work, focus on cultural diplomacy, and I always like to say to Mark, I put the culture in cultural diplomacy, because it's far too daunting to take on the American education system. And most people learn what they learn from culture, very often popular culture. That's why I put a lot of effort into trying to enlarge, expand, make more authentic images of Muslim and Islam and themes related to Muslims and Islam in American popular culture, because people are not learning anything at school, and so they're only going to learn it through TV. So they need to see that Muslim Americans are not always terrorists and are many, many other things. So in many respects, America is a country in crisis right now. Having said that, you know, we are just sort of constitutionally not perhaps as much of a team player as the European countries are, and so America tends a little more to try to lead, and that can have catastrophic results, as it has with the invasion of Iraq, and it looks like maybe even true for Afghanistan as well. And I think actually the biggest shortcoming there is not so much not wanting to go along with the team. I think, quite honestly, America is always going to lead, but I think it's actually a significant amount can be attributed to a lack of attention to culture. And I don't say this trivially, but I'm going to quote here Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian author, who said once that culture humanizes while politics tends to demonize. And I think part of the problem is the United States behaves in the world as if everyone were only a political being, and as if it were all only about politics. But countries, particularly countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, have incredibly rich histories and cultures. And if you don't begin by trying to have a deeper understanding of those very complicated histories and cultures, you're never going to prevail politically. And so I think that's part of the problem, the mistakes that we've made.
Europe's response.
No, I think in response I will say something about Europe, maybe mixed comments, but also something about America. I share many of the views that you have described in relation to the importance of understanding cultures that are not well understood in the United States at the moment. But I don't know if I would be quite as negative about the role that America is currently playing in the world. I mean, you know, whatever debates have taken place, and certainly have taken place over the past month, about domestic and economic policy, which I think was largely driving last week's election results. I think it is, I mean, it may have been missed by a large number of Americans that this has happened, but I think the way that the American administration has changed, I think quite decisively and very distinctively changed international engagement over the last 2 years, has made a difference, and you know, I think will make a difference, and I hope that that continues, whatever debates have to take place with Congress over economic policy and domestic policy. I genuinely hope that the direction in which American diplomacy and international relations have gone over the last 2 years, that direction is maintained, and Obama and Clinton and the others managed to do that without winding up too many people in the way that perhaps they've been wound up on economic policy. So I think that's a good sign. I would also say, and I think diplomacy, cultural or otherwise, is a very important skill. And you know, I mean, I regularly hear at events like this intelligent contributions from American diplomats. So sometimes I think American diplomats beat themselves up a bit about the lack of knowledge of international affairs of ordinary Americans. But I think America actually has quite a great tradition of professional diplomacy, and maybe that's something that the politicians in America need to recognise more and make more use of. In relation to Europe, I think the point that Anthony Giddens made last night, for those of you who were here towards the end of the session, about the disappointment that was felt by pro-Europeans or realistic Europeans when relative unknowns were appointed to the position, the two key positions created by the Lisbon Treaty, was a valid point, although I would have to say I think both individuals are actually doing quite a good job with the remits and the resources they have to hand. I think in particular Cathy Ashton has done a remarkable job in 9 months, given where we started from. But I think there is a real crisis of confidence and clarity in the European Union about its position in the world. There is, potentially as damaging as that American crisis of confidence can be. And I think across the European Union, there is a need for much greater clarity about what the European Union stands for in international institutions and international discussions. Not just a greater clarity about who speaks for the European Union, but a greater clarity of purpose as well. And I think there is a continuing problem between the key role that Britain and France play, maybe perhaps in the future in a more coordinated way, but Britain and France play in the Security Council as permanent members, the different relationships with Russia that there are amongst different key member states in the European Union, and different attitudes, particularly to the future membership of Turkey. But I think wider than that, the European Union is not at all clear where it stands at the moment in international climate change negotiations in a way that it once led the world. It no longer does that, in my view. I think the European Union does not use effectively the leverage that would come in international discussions from its huge contribution to development aid. And I think the European Union could be a much more positive force for good in post-conflict reconstruction. I'll say something about that later on. But I think there are issues there about the European Union's foreign engagement that need to be resolved. And the final brief point I would make by way of introduction is that I think in all of this, we focus in far too many of these discussions on short-term problems and short-term objectives, and the politicians across the world do the same thing, because they're all elected for 3 or 4 year terms. Obviously that's different in 1 or 2 countries, but most countries elected for 3 or 4 year terms, or they perhaps sit on the Security Council of the UN for 2 years and then are off again. Politicians and governments, I think, resort to far too many short-term decisions in international relations, just as they sometimes do at home. And I think there is a need for a serious long-term strategy on this very topic, how to move from... You cannot move from crisis management to conflict prevention without a long-term, and I mean a decade or more, strategy to build up the capacity of neighbouring states to support states that are either coming out of conflict or might disintegrate into conflict, either with each other or internally. And again, I'll say a bit more about that later on today. But I think I do think that's a key issue for us: is how can we build a long-term capacity, a long-term resilience and support mechanism, and do that on a regional basis rather than try and do it from Brussels or New York or anywhere else for that matter.
Well, when we come to... there's an enemy right front here. Okay. We come to Afghanistan, and I would like to ask Jalali about the possibilities there would have been, or would there have been, any possibilities to prevent the present conflict. And Afghanistan is a country which has a history of crisis, wars caused by intervention from outside. So the Brits and the Russians learned this the hard way. So will the NATO operation also end up in the same manner? But before that, I would like to really ask you, there was a period after the Russians withdrew when Afghanistan was more or less neglected. And wasn't that a huge mistake? But with the qualification that the neglect did not exclude providing arms and money to various factions in that country. So are we now actually paying the price for what we did not do or neglected to do in the 10-year period before that?
Thank you. It is not only neglected or the neglect of the Soviet withdrawal. It was the way the war was supported against the Soviet Union. Reaction to the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan was the traditional reaction in Afghanistan. People who stood up against the Moscow-backed government or the Soviet invasion later was just to defend their villages, the villages, against an ideology that they didn't accept. So it was local, the resistance was local. And it was the same as in the 19th century when they stood up against the British invasion. After the British forces left Afghanistan, they didn't claim to go in and seize the control of the government. And they just wanted to fight an invasion. The same thing happened, but unfortunately it became the confrontation between East and West. It became the battlefield of Cold War. All countries who were on the two sides actually joined in the fighting, and Afghans just became a pawn. And in order to defeat the Soviet Union at that time, they brought everybody who could fight the Soviet Union, including the fundamentalists and fanatics, to fight the Soviet Union. In 1983, I was giving a paper in a conference in California, Monterey, California. And I was the only person that believed that the Soviet Union is going to eventually leave Afghanistan. Because, and then you have to think what is going to happen to Afghanistan at that time. And the reason I was said that the Soviet Union is leaving, because they said Afghans are fighting not as a group, as an army. They fight for every village, and the Soviet Union has to fight for every village. And people don't care if they win or they lose, or they get killed. They think it's the right thing to do. So how long the Soviet Union can kill Afghanistan? At the same time, that was the year that General Agorkov, the chief of general staff of the Soviet Union, published his famous treatise in defense of the motherland. And that was, he said that if the Soviet Union does not catch up with the high tech with the West, in 10 years it will turn into a third world country. In order to do that, it had to change. In order to change economically, but first it had to change politically. How long the Soviet Union can stay isolated from the international community because of Afghanistan? Is it worth it for the Soviet Union? So it will leave. When it leaves, all these people that we are bringing to give a bloody nose to the Soviet Union is going to be there. Then it is very difficult. If the situation after a war is not better than the situation before the war is not worth fighting. And at that time, I was told by several of the panelists that, look, the Soviet Union is not going to leave Afghanistan. It will leave only when it turns into another Mongolia or another satellite country, and then we'll leave some forces there, and then we'll leave. So it is going to be a long war. It is, there's only one generation of moderate Muslims like you, and several generations of fundamentalists. So these are going to take, this is going to be a long war. It's not a war for moderates, it's a long war for people who will fight rigid further. That was the mistake. And when the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, the Moscow-backed government collapsed, then everybody walked away and left that mess. And when you, sometimes when you ask Afghans, what do you want from the international community? A new strategy, more troops, more money? And some people will tell you very simply that no. Can they undo what they did to us in the past 30 years? That was the problem. Yes, it was neglected Afghanistan after. And then the neighbors came to finish the job and destroy that country. That country lost 1.5 million, according to the United Nations, civilians during that war. Infrastructure was destroyed. The institutions were destroyed. The state institutions were no longer there. People became fragmented. The agriculture system was destroyed. So in that time, that broken country expected that the international community would come and help this country. Many left Afghanistan, but many neighbors, and I'm sorry to say, even many brother Muslim countries, they came to Afghanistan not to help that broken nation. but to exploit it, how you can exploit that broken nation. And that you saw that Al-Qaeda started there, networks started, Al-Qaeda, Pakistan intervened, Iran intervened, and therefore that country actually became the scene of a civil war, a surrogate war fought by other forces. That is the story of Afghanistan. But now I come back to this theme of crisis management, crisis prevention. Crisis prevention is a very, something that we wish it happened, but it never happens. Because crisis prevention is when somebody believes, or a country believes that this conflict is coming, and it is too important for that country that probably it will become interest. Otherwise, before a conflict happens in many parts of the world, many countries don't care if they put prevent the conflict. It is very difficult to get interest of nations to prevent a conflict that they don't know. But crisis management has other dimensions. Crisis management, it depends where it happens. Is it in Europe? Is it in Asia? Is it in Afghanistan? Is it in India? Where it happens? And how much weight does it have on the region in international politics? Wars are not something optional. You are forced to go to war. So therefore, the management of crisis is the same thing. If a crisis is so important for a country, it will get involved. On the other hand, in the United States, you say, we talk about the United States. The United States, in policy-wise, it lives in the mood of post 9/11. In politics, not. Because people are more concerned about domestic issues and in this long war. But policy-wise, it's still not after 9/11. So therefore, how you do it? Even when that in the United States you have some kind of sense of isolationism, that the thing that happened in the world actually forces the United States. And that's what they cannot do Afghanistan. But yes, the United States have the institutional capacity to do that. Both the United States and NATO today that do not have the institutional capacity to face the challenges or the new threats after Cold War. Unless they change, for example, NATO, unless NATO change, it remains a NATO, a European NATO, an old NATO, I don't think there's a need for NATO anymore. If NATO wants to be a NATO of the future, to face new threats, not only in Europe, but other parts of the world, it has to change. It has to change institutionally to be able to have that capacity. In Afghanistan, it's 10 years. You do not have a very good plan to get peace, which is the most important element in post-conflict situation. It's the face of legitimacy of the government. But they turn it into security force and counterinsurgency force. Because they do not have national police force in the United States. And all contractors come and do the job. So you have to build that institutional capacity first in order to be able to manage a crisis. Otherwise, the United States, a great country, great power, a leader in the world, but it is good in short and big wars, but not in long and small wars, because that capacity is not there, institutional capacity. So this is the story of Afghanistan even after the removal of Taliban. That I discussed it this morning, that different countries came. Different countries came with different levels of the commitment, resources, agendas, and that's not. You create more crisis than managing the crisis. I will say only this.
Mr. Von, Dr. Gerges might give us a few pointers on how do we prevent the next Middle East war.
I wish I had an answer. But, I just want to put most of some great points have been made. I just want to put some conceptual points on the table and see whether we can make sense of the whole paradigm. I think what my colleagues indicate is the need for what I call the construction of a new international security paradigm. let me flesh out what I mean by a new international security paradigm. We're talking about the anniversary of the end of the Cold War. We know what the Cold War was, a bipolar system. And of course, the end of the Cold War ushered in a bipolar system, the United States of America. From 1989, I would say, up to September 11, the morning after. That was America triumphant, dominant. It really acted unilaterally in a quite a very ambitious way. After 9/11, we had a brief moment of what we call, the American moment, that is unilateral American actions and the whole notion of using military force unilaterally. In fact, really, we have not even appreciated the concept of what President Bush did on the morning after 9/11. In fact, the whole system of collective security evaporated overnight. You have 50 years of collective security that was discarded by President Bush at great cost for both America and the world. And I wonder for a moment whether now we are going through a transitional period in what I call a vacuum of a security paradigm in the international system. We had the bipolar American system, we had the American moment after September 11, that is unilateral strikes militarily. And now there is the reason why this is a very, pivotal moment in world history, because I think Cynthia is absolutely correct. We have vacuum, we have security vacuum, we have American decline. Whether we like it or not, I think America is not in the same position that it was from 1989 up to the present. American decline is real, even though American authority and American power is there, but American decline is real because not only the institutional capacity, also because of intellectual and political capacity inside the United States. We know that America's commitment in Afghanistan is very limited. It will be limited. The United States cannot wage multiple wars on multiple fronts. It's too costly. The United States cannot afford this. There is no public support in the United States anymore for either the Iraq war or the Afghanistan war. And I think everything the United States is doing in Afghanistan to provide a way out, as opposed to really, have a long-term engagement in Afghanistan. Just to come back to the question about conflict prevention, crisis management, and conflict. Let's see what has happened after 9/11. America's unilateral, ambitious intervention in the Middle East. And see where we are today. You have now raging fires throughout the Middle East. Iraq, I don't need to tell you, is a work in progress. Iraq could either plunge into all-out war or basically go, stabilize in the next 10 years, truly. You have Lebanon on the verge of another bloody civil war. I don't need to tell you what's happening in Lebanon. Sudan, again, is a country, who knows what's going to happen in the next few months, in particular if Sudan breaks down. Yemen is not only a failing state, Yemen also on the verge of, you're talking about conflict. We can talk about on and on various countries in the Middle East, and to mention Pakistan, Afghanistan as well. Pakistan is, again, I don't think it's an understatement to say it's one of the most dangerous countries in the world for a variety of reasons, because of not only institutional vacuum, but also, the rise of the Taliban. It's a nuclear power, a weak government. And here, I think at the end of the day, it's not only about the crisis of American leadership, global leadership, it's also a crisis of European leadership. Where's the European Union? And I think you're absolutely correct, Jack, about this. Here you have, it's a crisis of confidence, it's a crisis of direction, it's a crisis of leadership. Europe has not really been able to delineate and define a strategic paradigm for its security. Europe, has been, feeling well to follow the United States. But the United States is facing a major crisis, and I think it would be wonderful for Europe to articulate, to construct a new security paradigm. And since we know that neither Europe nor the United States at this particular junction has the capacity or even the will to really play an active role in the international system, I would like to really reconsider the entire security paradigm and say, take the Middle East. To what extent can Turkey, what kind of role Turkey can play in the security of the Middle East? I think whether it's on the Arab-Israeli conflict, or whether in terms of economic development, or whether on the nuclear program, I see Turkey really as a great force for stability, a great force for prosperity, It's a bridge between the East and the West. I would like a greater role for the Arab League, if the Arab League can be really reformed. Turkey with the Arab League, in order to deal with what I call the spreading fires throughout the region. Neither the United States nor even the European Union can really appreciate the complexity, the cultural complexity, the tribal complexities, the social complexity of what's happening in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Sudan, and what have you. And that's why I wonder whether the construction of this, what I call international security paradigm, must take into account regional players, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Turkey, and really try to fill the vacuum of international leadership. I want to stop here and take some more questions from the audience.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm sure that you will have comments, and I will take a few from the floor too. There is one or two. Okay, can you give the microphone?
Yes, thank you. I would like to pick up on a keyword that Lord McConnell raised, the UN Security Council. And I would like to ask a brief question and invite you to imagine that both the Security Council and the General Assembly would tell all of you, you tell us 3 bullet points and we will okay it. So there's no limit as to, yeah, the superpowers will never give up their veto and so forth. And just for those that haven't followed so closely the UN Security Council discussion, possible ingredients would be, should there be no permanent seats at all? Should everybody have a permanent seat? Should it be enlarged? Should it be smaller? Should veto be abolished? Should they keep the veto, others not have it? I mean, it's many points that you could have. So perhaps if you could do 3 bullets and they will green light it and implement the very things you are suggesting. Thank you.
You want to respond immediately? While you're waiting for the microphone, I would say my opinion on the Security Council reform, because a few years ago we were almost there. There was a big consensus that the Security Council would be enlarged to about 23 members, and that there would be new permanent members without new vetoes, but without doing away with the old vetoes. Now, in a perfect world, there would be no old vetoes either, but we are not living in a perfect world, and we are not going to get that kind of Security Council. So we were almost there, and it was the African Union which did not get its act together, in fact allowed Gaddafi to hijack the whole operation, and since then things have fallen apart. But it's still there, and I would want to also see the kind of the Security Council reform combined with into making it a new G20. The G20 is today the real nucleus of global governance efforts, but it lacks legitimacy. In its representatives, certainly, because it covers all the big economic powers and also the population, but it lacks legitimacy. And if we had a Security Council of about 20, 25 members, this could become the new G20, because then there would be a sort of formally democratic element. Every country has its right to its 50 minutes of fame by getting elected to the Security Council once, and they already have the negotiating machinery on hand, so that would be one answer to it. But,
this will not be exactly 3 bullet points, but I'll be as close as I can. To the Security Council, I would say set a deadline for reform, a firm deadline, and with or without the existing veto countries, which might be part of the negotiations, you have to accept that there has to be a more representative permanent basis to the Security Council. But that also needs to retain the occasional membership of smaller nations. However hard it is for them to sustain that membership, I think the occasional voice from smaller nations in the world is quite important in the Security Council. I don't want the Security Council to be the G20. I think that's okay in the current economic climate to have the G20 performing that role, but the Security Council has to represent some of the smaller nations as well as larger permanent nations. But there are now more large players in global politics, and they need to have at least a more regular, if not a permanent voice in there. But the quid pro quo would be to the General Assembly that I wouldn't agree to the first without a dramatic change in the way the UN operates. You cannot have a more representative Security Council, in my view, without at the same time having an absolute streamlining of the bureaucracy, a change to some of the appointment procedures, the idea that there are rotas and quotas for incompetent people to get jobs, waste of money, duplication, all of that needs to change too. So I would get rid of the waste, and the deal would be a more representative Security Council that then takes some global leadership. And the third thing I would say is, without no offence at all to any of the post holders, because I think like Van Rompuy and Cathy Ashton in Europe, the people are good people who get these jobs and they try their very best in difficult circumstances. But the UN needs, as a Secretary General in the years to come, someone who's more of a general and less of a secretary.
I agree with those points. I'll just say quickly, when I was ambassador to the Netherlands, Libya was elected head of the Human Rights Council at the UN, which was particularly ironic since at that very moment we were holding the Lockerbie trial. The Dutch actually voted for Libya. They told me, well, you need a kind of taking down, so we're not going to vote for you. I said, watch out what you wish for, and voila. So when things like that happen, it is so hard to take the UN as seriously as it undoubtedly deserves to be taken. So, all these points are right, but I would just add to that this president takes the UN very seriously, and the clearest indication of that is his excellent appointment of Susan Rice as our ambassador to the UN, who was his closest foreign policy advisor, and she could have had any job she wanted. That's the job she got, and I know that she takes it very seriously, and I'll maybe just tell one famous story about her as to how seriously she takes it. She was in one of those endless negotiations over who knows what, and it was going nowhere. And so she took the portrait of her predecessor off the wall and held it up to the people with whom she was meeting and said, I guess he was right. This truly is a dysfunctional organization that cannot get anything done. And they got to a resolution very quickly. So it may not be perfect, but President Obama takes it very seriously and is trying to make it work.
Let's take the next question.
My name is Francis Kalangala. My name is Francis Kalangala. I am Congolese born, but I am a U.S. citizen. I have two questions. First one will be addressed to Ambassador Snyder. I agree with you when you said that in the United States we have a problem of education, cultural education, regarding with respect to history curriculum. But I can say to you that I'm from Africa, the Republic Democratic of Congo. I left my country 5 years ago. I became American citizen 2 years ago. And I can tell you that I'm proud to be American citizen. And why? Because I became more African by becoming American citizen. And even I live in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Bridgeport is a town, it's a state, global state. In my street have almost 200 houses with 150 different nationalities. And we know culture in America. Our problem maybe in America is we don't travel more. Okay, my question is, we are living in America now kind of social movement, Tea Party. And this movement, sometimes it's about tax, government, politics, but I'm worrying that it's like becoming as a crisis of identity, taking back America, giving back America to us. My question is, do you think that regarding to cultural diplomacy, the growing of Tea Party can have an impact cultural diplomacy of the United States? That's my first question. The second question for the panel is, as an African, I don't understand why Europe asked America to do something for Africa, because Europe is a bunch of countries who colonized Africa. Europe knows very well Africa and Asia. I think that Europe has a big responsibility to do the conflict prevention for Africa and the rest of the world. But why now the Europe is behind or following American policy to solve some African problem? That's my question.
Oh, two very good questions. The American question
Well, first, thank you so much for your question, and let me just say that you are what makes America a great country. I firmly believe that our identity as an immigrant nation, which despite the occasional hoo-ha from the Tea Party, that is our identity, absolutely rock solid. That's not going to change. And that is what, in my view, sets America apart. And I'm so glad you became a citizen, and I know you're going to go on to do great things for America. And I sometimes wonder myself, what if, and I'm not sure how you'd implement this, but what if when we, and when I say we, I do mean President Bush, and I don't consider that a we, but anyway, when he made the decision that we were going to go bring American democracy uninvited to other countries, what if the definition of American democracy had been a meritocracy and a society of equal opportunity for all, rather than voting? We seem to have made it voting, and voting obviously changes. They vote in Egypt. What good does that do? So voting is clearly not, in and of itself, of tremendous value. And somehow we defined democracy as voting, and the result's catastrophic. When, what makes, in my view, America a great country, and I do, of course, think it's a great country. I found that if I lead by bashing America, it tones down the bashing from everyone else. It is the fact that it is a land of opportunity. And I wish that we had found a way to help that aspect of American society develop in other countries. And it won't develop the way it exists in America, but in whatever organic way, I wish we'd managed to do that a little better. I would say don't panic about the Tea Party. A lot of noise, but they didn't do very well in the election. Actually, their candidates did not do very well. So I would totally not panic about the Tea Party. I think it's really a domestic thing. America always goes in and out of these insular moments, and there may not be a lot of popular support for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but that's not going to make much difference in the way we wage them. And I think it's unfortunate. The challenge is that our leaders, whether they're military or domestic or civilian, they are having to walk this line between domestic politics and international politics. And sometimes when things are said to please a domestic audience, that is unfortunate on an international level, and I wish they weren't said. So it was important to say domestically that we're setting a deadline for Afghanistan, but my guess is that some number of people are going to get on a plane next July, and a much larger number of people are going to stay, and we may call them something else, but it is not going to change all that much. I don't think it is. I mean, I may be wrong, but that's my guess. So a lot of this comes from the sort of confusion of domestic and international messages, and it was President Clinton who said domestic politics are international politics. That's been true for a long time. We haven't quite figured out how to do it. Who, by the way, also lost catastrophically after his first 2 years and still turned out pretty well. So I would say don't panic from this election.
I think I would have to take slight exception to your opinion on voting. I think voting does matter, provided they are free and fair elections.
Right.
So nominal voting, yes, but otherwise it would be sort of putting forward a Chinese ideal.
Let me just answer.
Everybody can get rich, but no votes.
No, I'm not saying people shouldn't vote. I'm saying it was naive to assume that if we just say vote, there will be a democracy. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
I wish everyone voted the way they vote in the United States and Europe, but that unfortunately doesn't seem to have turned out to be the case.
But regarding the European question, I don't think that Europe follows America in Africa. I don't think that Europe has any real coherent Africa policy. Europe doesn't have a foreign policy, so it's a vacuum. And then it may show that those who are more active show the lead, but we don't follow America. I don't think that we follow anyone. The problem is actually that and I witnessed this for 7 years on the External Affairs Council, that it was still very much a colonial mentality. So it was always the Belgians who took up what we should do with the Congo. It was always the British who took up Zimbabwe. It was the French who took up Chad, etc. And you remember very well these discussions. When they had problems, then they turned to the EU. But otherwise, But otherwise, they stay off. This is our turf, and this is not the way to run a European foreign policy. But I think we are slowly learning to do better.
I think, as I understand, Cynthia, is that voting on its own really does not produce a democracy. If you don't have the foundation, if you don't have the structure, if you don't have the cultural learning process, if you don't have the institutions, you end up really, let's talk about Iraq, for example. In every single election since 2003, the Iraqis are voting what? On a communal basis, period. So you really, instead of having Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated community now, you have a Shia-dominated what have you. I mean, this is the reality on the ground, not because Iraqis are not Democrats, but in a complex, fragmented, splintered societies, in a society where the state almost devoured, civil society itself. You have deep-seated, entrenched fears, and communities tend to vote for their own communities. In Lebanon, you have voted for how many years? The Lebanese vote along very simple lines. The Sunnis vote 100% Sunnis, the Shiites vote 90% Shiites, the Christians vote almost 60-40%. I think the big point really when we talk about democracy, we need to talk about the elements of democracy, not just the process itself, but what does it take to establish a foundation for democracy. On the question, you said, why does Europe follow America? Why does Europe really ask America to involve? I work on the Middle East, just to give you a glance what you're talking about. One of the fundamental goals of American foreign policy from the mid-1950s up to the present was and is to exclude Europe from the diplomacy of the great game in the Middle East. The fundamental goal of American foreign policy is to exclude, was to exclude the Soviet Union, and now to exclude. It is the United States would like to have a monopoly on diplomacy, in particular when it comes to the big question, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the question of oil, even the question of Iraq. This is in fact, to my mind, and the big question is that you need the new security paradigm needs to take into account the diversity of the international system. Not only between the United States and Europe dividing the spoils between themselves, but as you said, you're absolutely correct, taking into account the wishes, the desires, the hopes, and the aspirations of small powers, local powers that can really play a critical and pivotal and positive role in conflict management. Because surely, if we look at the conduct of American foreign policy, and as an American, I'm being very critical, if we look at the conduct of American foreign policy from the mid-1950s to the present, I think there's much to be desired and much to be improved. And unfortunately, I say very clearly and very critically, in fact, having won the Cold War, one of the greatest losses is that neither the West nor the United States has learned the lessons of how to conduct international relations in a different way. And that's why when the crisis came on the morning after 9/11, what did we do? Instead of using that great security structure that serves American interest. I mean, the collective security system, even after the end of the Cold War, the United States was the main beneficiary of the collective security system. What did we do? We went more and more unilateral. So the question is, to me, it's not whether, I mean, why Europe is asking the United States. I would like a more, you might say, balanced, more complex security paradigm where both the United States and the European Union, plus the new rising powers, plus pivotal regional powers, to really take responsibility for conflict management. Truly, truly. And this is, I know, we've stated, you have multiple fires. All it takes is a spark to ignite region-wide conflict. Neither the United States nor the European Union have the skills and the ability, the cultural skills and the ability to deal with the complexity of international conflicts today.
Councillor Jalali had to say something about voting in Afghanistan.
Well, I was the only person when we were adopting the constitution in 2003 that Afghans can wait until the institution are built, then election should be held, because election cannot bring democracy. Election is good. Democracy can not survive without voting, without election. However, without the rule of law institutions, the election becomes a playground for people with gun and money. That happened in 2005, parliamentary election. And worse than that was the recent parliamentary election in Afghanistan. 3 groups actually won seats. One, those who rigged the election, those who bought votes, and those who used government institutions in order to win a seat in the parliament. So what kind of parliament that will be for Afghanistan? They will support the interest groups, the illegal armed groups, and the power brokers. So therefore, it is I think democracy without election is not imaginable. However, only voting, only election cannot bring you democracy. I think we have to build. Afghanistan has a very painful experience in 1960s. 1963, 1973, that is called the decade of democracy. And without building institutions, there was democracy. There was freedom, there was free election, free voting, but no responsibility, no rule of law. So therefore, I think the democracy can be based on the rule of law, real representative government and accountable government, not the trapping of democracy that would.
Okay, I think we will slowly have to be winding up, but let's take one. Who do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, just to come back to the original point about Africa and responsibility. I mean, and it ties in a little bit with what's been said about voting. I mean, I think the President of Mozambique made a good point yesterday about the role of the Cold War in all of this, and it is surely not a coincidence that the first, if I'm right, the first post-colonial, post-election situation in Africa, where an existing leader lost an election and accepted the result, was, I think, in Benin in 1989. And it's not a coincidence that is roughly the same time as the Cold War was coming to an end. And I think sometimes we blame fresh, new, inexperienced post-colonial African administrations, let's call them that, sometimes with more democratic base than others, for what happened in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s, when actually so much of what was happening was being influenced, financed, driven by wider interests, global interests amongst the superpowers. I think the key problem is that the world has not found a way of moving on from that in a proper strategic sense. So, although we all know that the old Cold War is over, and there are perhaps other international issues that are starting to replace it, but and that therefore the relationship with Africa, with both Europe and North America and elsewhere, has changed. I don't think we've sorted out the international relationships that are needed in order to make up for that exploitation and the responsibility that we all have for what happened. The main responsibility lies with the previous colonial powers. I absolutely agree with you, but I think there's a global responsibility as well. I think the European Union could play a real role if it had a proper strategy for building up African institutions. And again, I might say something about that later on.
Okay, let's take one more question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the first-hand experience you have because it virtually veers away from the academic kind of knowledge basis we get into. Most of you worked in these fields. I wanted to touch on first in regards to conflict prevention. I virtually studied Dr. King's methodology where he deals with the two states, which is normal and pervasive. He says when it gets to avert, you really can't do anything about it. But most of the dialogue you've been having today virtually speaks to things which are in an overt state. So my first question would be, as just a couple, they virtually link into one another. If conflict management is a long-term undertaking, what structural changes can be implemented within the national context of states where ethnic and internal conflict is a distinct possible outcome of internal instability? And I'm only bringing this question because we're talking about conflict prevention. Because if we're taking hindsight as being a wonderful thing in conflict prevention, and we know about the Rwanda case where 1 million were lost in 100 days, pretty much so logistically, 10,000 a day, and it wasn't by gun, it was by machete. And the intelligence spoke about 6 months before it was known about this. So with conflict prevention, with the first question, I'm coupling it with what lessons have we not yet learned from the past mistakes in crisis situations such as in Rwanda? And finally, dovetailing, because you helped me out on that, in terms of Pakistan, and you talked about the situation in Pakistan, the nuclear situation, the Taliban, their institutional vacuum, and we can add Kashmir. So let's just take this morning, again on CNN and BBC, President Obama virtually did what our Prime Minister, David Cameron, did in India and virtually bashed Pakistan. So let's just put a hypothetical scenario. In the hypothetically speaking, if all the crucial signs pointed towards the potential for Pakistan to descend into a serious internal conflict, what could the international community do in this instance? So these would be my two phrase questions. Thank you very much.
Now we are back to basics, I think, and given the fact that we are only 1 hour 15 minutes late from the timetable, I think that we have to slowly wind up and have a last round, and we will start with you. And you can also answer the questions, but make also your final comments, please.
Thank you so much. I wish you had asked the question earlier. You would have, because you have multiple questions. I'm really glad that you brought the internal dynamics into play. I mean, we can sit down here and bash the great powers and blame the United States and colonialism. We do. I mean, that's unfortunately, and I agree that the colonial, role is very critical. But the reality is, whether you look at, most of the developing countries now, whether you're talking about African countries or whether it's Iraq or whether it's Lebanon or Sudan, you have internal dynamics, tribal-based societies. What's distressing about Africa and the Middle East, they're institutional wastelands, truly institutional wastelands. And before you can talk about conflict prevention, how do you rebuild the institutions? How do you create the frameworks? How do you create, as you said, the rule of law? It's not about really voting. It's about you need to create the foundational aspects of societies. Those are lacking. The reason why this is when we say it's an institutional wasteland, because in the absence, when you don't have institutions, what do communities do? Communities fall back on what? On their ethnicities, on the sects, on tribalism, and that's exactly what you have. So in Lebanon now, when you don't have transparent institutions, Lebanon is a case in point. I keep harping on Lebanon because if you really want to talk about conflict prevention, here you have a country now is on the verge of coming apart as a result of multiple challenges and threats. What do you do? How do you prevent this country from coming apart? Sudan is another example. Again, the lack of institutions. And that's why it seems to me I'm sorry to say, my faith in the great powers has diminished a great deal. I just don't think that the great powers really do appreciate the complexities. I mean, take Lebanon, for example. Again, 1 second just to give you an idea. Here you have a country that basically is on the verge of coming apart, and that because of the Hariri Tribunal, some of you who know it's, and the United States, and it's correct, the United States is insisting that the tribunal basically take place, but that the very tribunal could bring about this, I mean, this particular process of communal, what do you do in this particular situation? This is a very complex question, and that's why I want to see more really critical roles for regional powers. Regional powers that basically know the neighborhood, regional powers that have vested interest in stability in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I've seen conflict from different perspectives, from different sides. I was, during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, I was insurgent as part of the resistance. And after the removal of Taliban, I was counterinsurgent, trying to fight the insurgency. What matters that people choose between violence and peace as what opportunities are available. And just exclude people and then you turn them into insurgents, you turn them into terrorists and whatever you need. I think Pakistan for many years neglected the federally tribal, federally administered tribal areas in Qatar. They are subject to the frontier crime regulation, which was went in force in 1905 during the British Raj. And that means that they are not subject to the laws of Pakistan. They were neglected to do. The education was not developed there. And for a violation of one person, the whole tribe was punished. And so therefore, that was very fertile ground for the insurgents or terrorists to influence. On the other hand, when there's a state whose institutions are weak, or when people believe that their interests are not served by state institutions, they go to their tribal networks, to social networks, to ethnic networks. I believe in Afghanistan at least, or self-determination is in the region. Individual decides where he can find solution to his problems. If the state can do that, fine. I think they would prefer that, particularly in an atomized society. But if not, they will go and find it. And that becomes the introduction or the prelude to intra-tribal ethnic fight over scarce resources, particularly as poverty is there. I believe that the conflict prevention is very difficult. The crisis, catch the attention when it is already a crisis. And before crisis happens, you cannot find a lot of enthusiasm that will do something in order to, individually, individual countries, or bilaterally, or multilaterally. It is very difficult. So there's a crisis. When the crisis happens, then everybody, but it's too late usually.
Well, one part answer, and only a partial answer, is the role of the NGOs and CSOs, which I took up in my introductory remarks. Because if you have somewhere there is hidden information of a genocide on the make, but it's kept secret because the government doesn't want to be involved, I'm glad that we have WikiLeaks. We need institutions like this. We need movements, campaigns like this, which can bring these situations to the open, and then create the sort of momentum and campaign momentum which forces governments and the international community. It's not perfect. They do not always do the right thing, but I think it is an additional factor which can help in conflict prevention, and I think we should support it. I'm sorry I have to do a disappearing here because my plane is leaving, but you will manage better without me.
Thank you very much to the moderator. Can I make 2 points that are kind of related, and at the risk of being seen to too often defend the United States of America, which is not my usual habit. Can I just say that I think we need to keep a balance in all of this. The only world leader who has really apologised for what happened in Rwanda is President Clinton. And I know I've spoken to him about this. He feels guilty about what he did and about the fact that it was a response to what had happened to American peacekeepers, in the years previously. His foundation's active there. I helped his foundation on education projects there. I know why they're there and how much work they do. But at least he feels guilty. The members of the General Assembly of the UN and the members of the Security Council who don't like international intervention, even to prevent genocide, have never apologised for what happened in Rwanda. There are other world leaders who were on the Security Council in '94, and there are other world leaders who were on the General Assembly in '94, and some of those world leaders are still running their countries. While it's easy for us all to bash the USA, and their response to these things, it's partly because the USA is more transparent, more accessible than many other places, that they do become the focus of our attentions, because we believe we can change what the USA does, and we sometimes don't believe we can change what others do. So I think we need to keep a spread of our analysis of that. And so it's partly linked to my second point, which is about the regional powers. I agree absolutely that the future solutions are regional. But what I would not like to see is a situation where the most powerful country in every region has the most influence over the neighbourhood. Because, while certainly my generation horrified at what the US was doing in the 1980s in Central America, for example, but I'm also horrified at what was happening in the Indian neighbourhood, in the Chinese neighbourhood, in the Russian neighbourhood. Big powers like to exert control and influence and distort the results of elections and the economies of their next door neighbours for their own interests, and that has happened as partly as in the Cold War, but also with the Cold War as well. And I think we just need to be, I think we should be aware of all big powers. And I think what we need is a regional balance, a check and a balance that involves other countries in the neighbourhood, and ensures that we don't have overbearing powers that have too much influence. Look at Nepal, for example. A beautiful country with beautiful people, with a chaotic system of government and dreadful poverty, largely because it is stuck between two major powers who both have a huge influence, and actually, in many ways, are also increasingly worried about a further powers happening, to the it might move across, the Taliban or whatever, moving across from Afghanistan. So there's they're caught in the middle of something there. Not their fault, but they're a very good example of no US involvement at all. This is other big powers causing real problems in that country. So I would just have a bit of a plea perhaps for balance and making sure that we look at solutions that are not just about containing the US, but are about containing big power and making sure that there's a better organisation on the regional basis where neighbours can help each other, and as a result, because they know each other better, as is increasingly the case in Africa, help prevent conflict. And I think one of the few reasons why there's likely to be, and it's still only likely, a referendum in southern Sudan in January is because the leadership of African countries is on the case, and they are pressing for that referendum to take place. And that's not going to happen from influence from elsewhere. But if the African leadership keeps saying to Bashir, it's got to happen, and help him and others deal with the consequences of a referendum that might lead to secession, then that is a much better solution than the international community or America or Russia or anybody else coming in and forcing them to do it.
Thank you so much. You stick with me. I'll bash the United States. You defend it. It's much better than American defending it. Yeah, it's much better. Just really quickly on what you said about Pakistan. I think there, as in so many countries, what is so challenging is that the government is so weak and so corrupt and so awful. So what do you do? And the real challenge, and I think the United States is trying to do this. I think we're trying a little bit more to do this in Afghanistan. Is how do you reach the effective civil society institutions and bolster them, from the outside? And I think they have such an important role, much more of an important role than I think we've generally realized, but we're starting to understand this now. I'll just give one small example, since we're in the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. This is a theater group that I had the privilege of meeting the leader of a few weeks ago at a conference in New York. And he has this called the Ahsoka Theater Group. It's been going for 20 years. He has an incredible production ongoing now that is periodically shot down by the government. It's called Burqa Vaganza, and it is a musical comedy. We can laugh about this. It's okay. Pakistanis laugh is a big revelation for people in the United States. They're not all crazy terrorists. They actually make jokes like real people. And it's a hilarious musical comedy. And everybody's wearing a burqa, men, women, children, trees, everybody's wearing a burqa. And, it's a spoof on this kind of pretense of religiosity. It's shut down periodically by the government. I think one of the most important things that the United States or any other country in any position of power and influence, and basically if you give as much money as we do, you hopefully are in some position of power and influence, is to keep the free media space open. Because ultimately it is about holding governments accountable. And even with governments that show as little promise as that one, if you keep holding them accountable again and again, it's the only way they reform. And as for all the bashing of the United States, we're a country that's founded on dissent. That's our energy is dissent. So it's okay.